So I'd like to welcome you all to this event, which is hosted by the LSE's Centre for Women, Peace and Security and sponsored by the European Research Council's Gender Peace Project. My name is Louise Arimatsu and I'll be chairing today's event unless I lose connectivity, at which point my colleague, Dr. Sarah Smith, will be taking over. Now, before turning to the substance of this event, Transformative Peace and National Action Plans Yemen Story, I'd like to run through a couple of practical matters. First, we request that you all disable your cameras as this will assist us. I also draw attention to the fact that you've all been muted as is now common practice. But this does not mean that we've silenced you. If you'd like to comment, share your views, or indeed raise questions during the Q&A session, please do send them using the chat function. My colleagues will be monitoring your contributions and collecting questions for the speakers. In terms of format, Dr. Swaine will be opening. Dr. Swaine will speak for about 10 minutes and set the broader global context. We will then specifically turn to the case of Yemen. Rasha has been invited to speak for about 20 minutes. We have also set aside a little time for the speakers to engage with one another. We will then open up the discussion and be taking 2 to 3 questions at a time from the audience. As we have limited time, rather than unmuting you, we ask that you send us your questions. Now, it is of course trite to say that we are all living in an extraordinarily disruptive time in history. As individuals and as part of communities, many of us are struggling to make sense of what is unfolding around us locally as well as globally. But amidst all this chaos, there are some whose voices remain steady, who remind us of what is important and who, through example, provide us with guidance. Although they will deny that they have such influence, I think both our speakers today do that through their work. So it's a real privilege for me to welcome them today. Both are passionate advocates for and leading experts in the field of women's rights in conflict and conflict-affected situations, the WPS agenda and NABS. Many of you have joined us today because you're already familiar with the exceptional work being undertaken by both speakers. Swaine is Associate Professor of Gender and Security with the LSE's Department for Gender Studies. Ashling's research and teaching interests are in the areas of feminist legal theory and gender theory of armed conflict, international security and peace building. Her work is concerned with feminist examination of international law and global normative developments relating to armed conflict and peace building. She has published widely in academic journals and books, and has also authored very many influential policy documents, including in respect of NAPS more specifically. Rasha is an expert in gender, peace and security. She is co-founder and director of the Peace Track Initiative. Rasha was one among 7 women who were invited by the UN Special Envoy to Yemen to support peace talks held in Kuwait in 2016. She has briefed the UN Security Council on Yemen and women's rights to push for peace. She has over 15 years of experience working to promote the rights of women, children and refugees with organisations such as UNICEF, UNDP and JICA in Yemen and across the MENA region. So without further delay, I hand over to my colleague, Dr. Swaine. Aisling.
Thank you, Louise. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. And thanks to the LSE Centre on Women, Peace and Security for organising this event and for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of the talk, and I'm like many of you, I think, will be looking forward to hearing from Rasha specifically around Yemen. As Louise said, my role here really is to set out some of the broader agenda around women, peace and security and national action plans, set out some of the trends around where I suppose we're heading to, where we've come from around national action plans. And I'm going to just share with you, hopefully I've done that right, a PowerPoint in which simply because I have some data I want to show you in a couple of minutes' time, and I think it's easier to kind of just demonstrate that rather than talk around it. So I have 10 minutes. I'm going to talk very briefly around the general global context, 2 national action plans, where they've come from and where we're going to. Many of you listening, I'm sure, will be familiar with this already, but I want to just make sure we're all on the same page and have that general context. I look very briefly at the regional context for Yemen, basically the MENA region, and what action planning in the region has looked like, and raise some critical issues and gaps that have come up with action plans, as is the intent of today's overall talk, if you like. And then just very briefly at the end, wrap up some final points around what we mean by transformative action planning or transformative peace. And this is a very brief interjection on this, so forgive me for my brevity on that, but just for the purposes of setting a broader context. So if I can get my, hang on, PowerPoint, it was sticking earlier, let me see. There. Okay, so I'm going to set the broader context. And first, on the left-hand side, the global context. I suppose, first of all, for us to acknowledge that when we talk about national action plans on women, peace and security, we're really talking about planning as a response to the gaps in the implementation of the WPS agenda. In the early 2000s, after the adoption of 1325, we were waiting for states to take on the mantle that was passed to them through the adoption of Resolution 1325. And with those gaps came a response from civil society to demand that member states took what they said they would do and actually put it into action. Gender planning, or planning for the implementation of policies, laws, etc., has been a response that we've seen in many global international instruments, such as Beijing, the Beijing Platform for Action, and CEDAW, encouraging states to actually put in place measures and actions to implement their commitments. The idea of action plans for women, peace and security was introduced into the Security Council in 2002 and then 2004, the first action plan adopted by Denmark in 2005. To date, as of this year, 43% of UN member states have adopted national action plans. What we see is a disparate and uneven share of action plans in terms of our regional context globally. The majority of plans adopted by European states, 34 to date in Europe, followed by African states at 25 out of a total of about 84. I suppose the key things to point out here is that the idea of action plans is really important. As I said, it tries to translate the commitments in politics and law into kind of bureaucratic and actionable outcomes. And while we have, I suppose, some reason to celebrate the fact that states are committing to plans and are moving forward, and we see this level of actions to date, that hasn't come without challenges. And there's been a number of challenges that I want to point out that I think provide us with a broader understanding and framing for the relevance of action plans. And the key, even though we might see, I suppose part of the idea is that action plans are brought forward as a solution to the deficit or the problem in the lack of implementation of WPS, but the plans in themselves are not without their own challenges. And then we need to acknowledge that, I think, rather than just assuming that they are the answer to some of the problems that we see globally. I suppose the first thing to account for is that the key tension that has underpinned the implementation of the WPS agenda is a challenge to its universal adoption. There is some contestation in the Security Council itself, where the WPS agenda originated, as to whether the WPS agenda should be implemented in states that are not on the agenda of the Security Council, or are not countries that are in conflict. And we see countries like Russia and China, for example, of the Permanent Five, contesting this idea. And you know, the other P3 states have, so France, the UK and the US have adopted national action plans, but it doesn't go without contestation, and I think it's relevant for us to understand that. And we have seen at the beginning stages, I suppose in the first decade of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, a slower adoption of action plans by conflict affected states. And that's for many different reasons, and maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later. But there are issues around how conflicts are defined, who gets to define them. Is it the parameters of the Security Council and how they would define conflict? the first countries to adopt that are conflict affected are usually argued to be the Côte d'Ivoire in 2007, followed by Uganda in 2008 and Liberia in 2009. But if we take a critical eye, we could argue that the adoption of an action plan by the United Kingdom in 2006 was the first country affected by a conflict to adopt a plan because of the events in Northern Ireland and the fact that the United Kingdom has engaged in a peace process there. And this, I think, throws off for some of the conundrums with action planning, in that a lot of the plans have come out of, as I said, European states within foreign policy that are outward looking and see national action plans as a tool of that foreign policy, whereas conflict affected states are expected to take this up and do it in a particular way. I think this all feeds into giving a space to some states, particularly from Western European countries and Northern American states, to be able to argue for whether and how they would adopt women, peace and security. And I think it's some evidence of selectivity around what they consider to be their commitments or their responsibilities under WPS. And that's not just in terms of where and how they implement it, but also in particular issues. We see particular tensions in plans in European states, for example, who would have pillars on protecting women in faraway contexts as they would see them. So conflict-affected contexts, whether it's African or Middle Eastern or South American countries, where they put in place protections or humanitarian services, and yet in their own states, when those women who need protection are coming to seek asylum, we see a very different story in many of those states. So we really need to think through about what action plans are used for, and whether and how states are taking selective approaches in what they consider action plans to be in terms of their own uses for their own national and foreign policy. So moving over then to the regional view, the League of Arab States in the MENA region. So I'm going to focus on the MENA region broadly, so Middle East and North Africa. The League of Arab States adopted a regional plan in 2015. That's quite a dense document that sets out some of the commitments to international and global instruments on women's rights and gender equality, and does articulate some of the concerns of gender equality and women's rights in the region, particularly related to conflict and to broader peace and security. You know, I think we do need to acknowledge that prior to the Arab Spring, and certainly since the Arab Spring, there has been a range of peace and security issues in the region that has determined regional responses to this agenda, that has, I suppose, determined states' own agendas within how they engage with each other in terms of their inter-state relations, how they engage in multilateral systems like the UN, and then, of course, in their national context, because what you have here is a range of countries that are impacted by regional tensions and political dynamics, as well as a number of countries which have armed violence happening within their own borders. And we see those distinctions as important, I think, when we think about planning. So when we're planning to respond to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, how is my state planning to respond to that? Is that state involved in armed conflict itself? Is it impacted by regional tensions? What is its role in the tensions in that region? And will a WPS action plan actually acknowledge that and be tailored to those realities? We do see some tailoring in some of those plans. So to date, we have action plans adopted by Iraq, which was the first in the region to develop a plan and has since adopted a fuller plan. Jordan in 2017, Lebanon in 2019, Palestine in 2017, Tunisia in 2018, and of course Yemen in 2020, which Rasha will talk about in detail. And we see some, I suppose, diversification across those plans, as there should be, and we want plans to be tailored to the context that they're relevant to. Jordan, for example, takes a focus on the number of refugees that they are grappling with as a result of regional crises, and you know the intertwining of political and humanitarian crises in the region has been such an important imperative when we think about these issues. And then, of course, we have Iraq and Palestine, of course, which frames this plan around the Israeli occupation and how they frame that, and really important that we see those distinctions, but also commonalities, and we need to think about the regional implications as well. So moving on from that, and that kind of picture of where action planning is in the region, I pulled this quote out from the Jordan Plan, where the Jordan Plan sets out a very clear and ambitious aspiration to be a driver of peace and security in the region. And I really sit with that and think about that a little bit, because what does that mean? What does it mean for a state to be a driver of peace and security in the region? But for the purposes of us today, to think about what does that mean in respect of national action plans of women, peace and security? And a key thing to ask is, what are states planning for in their plans? So what are we planning for? And what are national action plans actually planning for? And I took this and looked at some of the plans in the region. I'm going to show you just the results of a very microscopic look at some of the results of action plans and analysis. I'm trying to get this to move. Hang on. It's a bit stuck. I think it's just slow because I'm on Zoom. This is the one slide I wanted to use, of course. Come on. How do I move this forward? Oh, there we go. Slowly. It's going. Okay. I'm just going to keep clicking this. I had a staggered approach, but I think, okay. So I did the piece of work for UN Women, and this is produced in a policy report for UN Women, which is available online if you're interested in looking at it. And it was in 2017. And basically, this piece took 3 plans that existed at the time, Iraq, Jordan and Palestine, and examined what those plans actually do in respect of addressing the rights and interests of women and girls in the region, in the countries that those plans are focused on. And you know, we can look at these plans in all sorts of different ways. We can examine them to see what the content is, what's driving them, how they're framing it, etc. What I did in this case was I took a gender planning approach. And just to mention very briefly that when we talk about planning for women, peace and security, there has been a body of gender planning work in the development sphere. And you know, part of the challenge that we're in here is that the UN tends to divvy up, or at least member states do, its work on peace and security development over here. And I thought, well, hang on, let's learn from what women's rights activists have done already in the development sphere. And there is a piece of work called gender planning and a tool called the Gender and Practical and Strategic Needs Framework, which was first came out of work by Maxine Molyneux in 1985, where she mapped out this idea that women have practical needs, which is the day-to-day, everyday, immediate needs, as well as strategic interests, so more broadly, their rights in terms of participating in decision-making, power and control over resources at state level and otherwise. And I thought, well, let's look and see whether the action plans are actually addressing women's practical and strategic needs or not. And to what degree the plans are actually focused on women and girls, because at the end of the day, the purpose of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, but to advance women's rights. So I took that, and if you look at the graph, the pie chart on the side, and I'll just talk through this for a couple of minutes to explain the implications of what I found. And this is a very narrow snapshot of the much broader work to be done on this, but it is interesting to look. So if we think about practical needs as the day-to-day, everyday survival needs, so having something to eat, having a shelter over your head, having access to healthcare, having access to water. And we know that in the region, many people are experiencing severe humanitarian crisis and gaps in their humanitarian needs. In those 3 plans, when I categorised the actions, only 8% of those actions focused on the day-to-day needs of women and girls. So the survival needs, the everyday, can I get up today and survive? 37% of the actions focused on the strategic rights, so women's participation in peace processes, women's participation in the workforce, women's livelihoods, women's reproductive rights, those kinds of more strategic rights-focused areas of women's decision-making. So there's quite an imbalance there, first of all, to observe. The other thing that came out of this is that when I looked at the plans, I found another category of actions within the plans. And what I called those is institutional interests of states. So what that is actions within plans that focus on the state itself and that focus on state actors. So for example, actions that focus on the need for training staff, on gender mainstreaming, actions that focus on state's own advocacy within itself and with its own actors around gender equality, around WPS, and actions such as capacity development and planning to plan, so putting in place institutional policies around gender equality, whether that's in defence or security, etc. So these are actions that are focused on enhancing the role of the state, if you like, or to be able to implement the plan. And what I found was that 55% of the actions in the plans, of the 3 plans, were focused on the state itself. So basically what we have are action plans from these 3 countries, when taken together, where the majority of the actions in the plan focuses on the state itself. Almost 40% focus on the strategic rights of women and girls, and just 8% focus on the practical day-to-day needs. Now, I've talked quite considerably with civil society actors around these dynamics and what they think of this. And just to note that this representation here of these 3 plans in this region is not unusual. I did the same analysis for Asia Pacific plans and found a similar dynamic where in the Asia Pacific National Action Plans, 52% were institutional focused. A key argument from civil society actors is that we need the state to understand gender equality and gender mainstreaming. We need actions in the plans to kind of give capacity to state actors to understand what the WPS agenda is about, and to have the capacity to listen to civil society and to do the things that we want the state to do. So I'm not arguing that institutional actions, focused actions, are a problem within plans, but I guess for us to think about whether the balance in the plans towards the state itself is what we want to see in these action plans, rather than focusing all of the resources and energy generated by an action plan towards the women and girls themselves that are affected by this plan. And you know, I think there really is an argument for us to consider here about, again, what are plans planning for? Are they planning for peace and security? Are they planning for improvements in women and girls' lives? Are they planning towards gender equality? Or is there more of a focus on these kind of, I suppose, bureaucratic processes, really, to get the state ready to engage with WPS? Now, and I'm just going to move on if I can. It's just not working again. Sorry, folks. There. For some reason, when I move the mouse, it moves. Okay, so my very last slide. Taking all of that, then, if we think about global trends and action plans and the regional trends, and then what we see as some of the gaps, I suppose, in these plans, we think about the subject of today, which is transformational peace, and Rasha is going to talk about that, I think, in more detail. And I'm going to put out some ideas here. It's by no means exhaustive at all. I don't even have a chance here to explore what do we mean by transformation, but you know, briefly what we want to see is changes, social transformation in terms of the inequalities that impact women and girls that have brought about the need for the WPS agenda in the first place. And we think back to then these plans, what are we planning for? And we think, I think, in terms of us being more transformative and intentional in how we develop action plans, we need to think about the purpose of planning. Why are we expecting states to plan? And there are these tensions that exist in terms of whether states are using national action plans as a tool for their own national or foreign policies, or they're using them to actually change what their foreign policy is saying and doing, or their national policy is saying and doing. Because the point of the WPS agenda is saying to the Security Council, is saying to member states, the way that you conceive of security, the way you conceive of peace doesn't work for women's lives. It doesn't fit with and address the structural inequalities that we are experiencing. So ideally, national action plans should be changing how we construct our institutions, our systems, our policies. And you know, are the plans being used to reinforce what states already want to do and use women's rights as instruments for that, or are they actually transforming that? And I think that's a real issue for all of us as activists to think about. And the key thing, of course, is the neglect, as we know, of the prevention pillar of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And again, to think about plans, are we using plans to prevent, to respond and stop violence, or actually trying to prevent it in the first place? Are we using plans to respond to the realities of women and girls who are experiencing conflict or otherwise? And in developing these plans, what are we setting up our institutions to do and to be? Are they going to be the kinds of institutions we want them to be around transforming how security and peace are lived, I suppose, for all of us? And I think that's a real concern for us in going forward as we get more sophisticated in how planning happens, I think, globally, whatever the country is. A key issue is the content of plans. And I come back to the graph that I just showed you. I think that relationship between practical and strategic needs is really important for us all to think about. If, for example, I am a woman who cannot satisfy my day-to-day needs to feed my kids, to have a shelter over my head, to have access to water, how are you expecting me to participate in a peace process? How are you expecting me to show up and be part of a political process? I have much greater concerns. And you know, I think we need to be concerned here about what that means for how our planning can be exclusionary of some women. If we have majority focus on strategic interests, which is women's participation, for example, in politics, does that mean that women who are of different ethnicities, rural, urban positioning, different sexualities, who experience discrimination in different ways, will they have a chance to participate, or are we working them out of the picture by the way that we're planning? And I think the balance between the relationship between practical and strategic interests of women and girls is really important, so that we're enabling you know, inclusion and participation of all women from different parts of the world and different lives, if you like. And a key part of that is that whether the plan itself is focused and geared towards not just women and girls and the actors in an institution, but also then changing the systems so that the way that we conceive of these things are being transformed. How plans are developed is really important. The Jordan plan and the Iraq plan, for example, mentioned that they did consultations with civil society and that they were involved. Many plans around the world say and claim to have consulted with civil society, and many have. There is where that does happen in a genuine way and states are involving civil society and hear their voices, it's really important. But then, of course, there's a difference between meeting with civil society and listening to them and then using that to actually transform or inform what the plan actually says. So even if I meet with you and I give you my ideas, are you actually using them? Or are you just taking the bits that suit you and having a selective approach to planning once again? Overall, and I'm going to wrap up here, and hopefully I've given some sort of framing to the conversation that Rasha is going to bring us into, and a much deeper dive, if you like, into the Yemen context. Is this, I think, the idea of push and pull factors. So the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the resolutions and the adoption of action plans really pushes open a space for us to make visible women's rights, women's experiences of conflict, and the way that we need to have a gender lens to the experiences of armed conflict for everybody. And so that space is pushed open by the adoption of these kinds of policies and these kinds of planning strategies. But that is pulled back or constricted by the way that states are interpreting how they plan. These selective approaches to what planning is for, whether it's reinforcing foreign and national policy or transforming it, whether they're deciding, well, these issues are for us and those issues we're not going to touch because, well, we're not interested or it's not politically expedient for us to do so. And key in all of that is in this space between the pushing open space for women's rights and the contracting back of that by politics, if you like, where does civil society fit? And the voices of civil society and the voices of women and girls who, in this case, are impacted by armed conflict. But to remember that, you know, WPS should be implemented universally. So whether there's a conflict present or not, to have the voice of civil society inform planning, I think being the most important response, I think, in terms of trying at least to adopt planning that aims to transform our institutions and our societies. So I leave it there. Thanks, Louise.
Thank you, Aisling. Wow, you raised so many questions for us, and I think Rasha can't wait to get in there. You know, I mean, you ended on two things: civil society's involvement in the development of national action plans, and I think Rasha, you will be able to sort of address this in the context of Yemen, but also NABS as a vehicle for transforming the lives of women and girls. To what extent has this idea, this aspiration, been included into Yemen's National Action Plan? So over to you, Rasha.
Thank you so much, Louise and Aisling, for a great opening to the session and bringing the global context and regional context. It's paving to the conversation that I'm planning to do now. So for Yemen context, just before I start to talk about the National Action Plan, I want to give you a little bit of background. So in Yemen, we had the Women National Committee as the main government institution that was established in 1996 in a response to the Beijing Platform of Action, which was basically, this is the main institution that's responsible for drafting policies on women's rights. Since the war started, this institution has been completely isolated and not supported, and the mandate of gender justice and women's rights policies have been tasked to the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor. And in the ministry, they only have a department on women rights. So we can see that because of this war already, this alienation happened. And even this mandate, when it moved to the Ministry of Social Affairs, this happened only last year. So since 2015 until only last year, they started focusing on gender justice issues in Yemen. As civil society actors, we have been calling for developing a national action plan for Yemen. We started officially calling for it in 2016, where we actually drafted a national agenda for women, peace and security. And we shared it with the national parties and also with the UN Security Council members. And the UN Security Council members officially welcomed this national agenda in 2017. So we've been working at the international level and at the local level to push for a national action plan. I think mainly because there was no funding for the government institutions. There was not a quick move towards doing this. And when we approached, for example, national offices of the UN, such as UN Women, to push for supporting the government to start drafting a national action plan, UN Women also did not see that as a priority. And and they were, I think the main concern was in programs to push for inclusion of women in the peace process and also the humanitarian aspect, but not supporting Yemen to draft the national action plan. So the government, let's say we have now the Houthis controlling a part of the country and then the government controlling the other part. The government started working on the national action plan last year, and by December they have approved the last, they have a number of drafts, and then in 2019 in December they have approved it in the ministerial cabinet. But they haven't done the official launch. They are supposed to do the official launch. For the Houthis, in 2017, the de facto government, which was the Houthis and Saleh, former, the GPC political party, in their government program, they have set an objective also to develop a national action plan. So this was in their radar. But and I think it was put mainly by Saleh supporters, the GPC party, not really the Houthis, because the Houthis blocked that and even changed their minister of human rights when she was trying to push for it to develop it further. So she was sidelined and another person came into her position. So to go back to the government's national action plan, one of the issues that were raised by UN agencies when we were pushing for supporting the government is that how is this national plan going to be implemented with so many actors responsible to implement at the ground? And we have, as civil society, we have proposed that they do regional plans or local plans and then build into a national one, but it could be per governorate, per thematic priorities, and we can further support these efforts. But our recommendations were not really responded to. So now going to the plan itself, I've shared with many who registered. I can see some names. They have received the informal translation of the National Action Plan. I'm happy to share it further. If someone is interested, please contact LSC and they can connect me and we can share it, or they can share it with you directly. It's a limited circulation document. It's not published yet officially, but we want to share this because we want also feedback and we want to try to actually push for improving it. So for this National Action Plan, first I want to talk about the process, how it was developed, then about the contents, and then some recommendations about how to improve it and talk about some gaps that exist. The process of developing it, the Ministry of Social Affairs and Labor formulated a team consisting of ministerial representatives, so government representatives, civil society representatives, and international organizations. But it was not, part of the ministers that were missing, for example, to be participating is actually the National Dialogue Minister. And for us, this is important because the National Dialogue has very strong references about outcomes that support women's participation and women's protection in general. So he was not involved, or his team. The other thing is that the civil society actors, there are only 7. So we have 16, I think was 16 government institutions representatives, 7 civil society women-led organizations, and then 2 international organizations and 4 UN agencies. So for the Yemeni women-led organizations, there were 7, but in conversation with them, at least 4 of them are members with us in the Women's Solidarity Network and partners with us in Peace Track Initiative. When we had a discussion with them, their comments and their feedback was not included in the final draft. And this was very disappointing to us because we held like consultations in the last 2 years on women, peace and security to feed in this plan with support from WELF and Norway and the Netherlands. And this, our voice was not completely reflected in the plan. So for the UN agencies, it was UN ESQA, UNHCR, IOM, and the fourth one, UNFPA. So, and for the international organizations, it was CARE and Friedrich Ebert. And I think Friedrich Ebert was, their support was limited to a workshop at the beginning of the planning of the, just about the frame or the outline of the plan. So, and in the plan itself, when they highlight the methodology, they mention 3 main workshops. One was to highlight the outline for the plan. The second was to do the revision of the draft. And the third one is referring to a capacity building for the staff of the government to basically develop the plan. That was it. That was the entire consultation. It was more focused in Aden. So there was no consultation with civil society beyond Aden Governorate. And these consultations were like 2 days consultation. What is disappointing is that we have shared the comments officially with the Prime Minister before the plan was approved. But nothing was reflected in the final. And when we discussed this with the Prime Minister, our partners discussed this with the Prime Minister, they were told that this was not officially shared with the Mola Minister. But at the end, we are speaking like there is bureaucracy, basically, as a reason for not including the voice. So another thing is in the plan, they refer to some, to the reference documents, let's say, that guide the process of this plan. And they heavily speak about IHL protocols and laws, but nothing on international human rights law, whether nothing on CEDAW, nothing on the Beijing Platform of Action, nothing on the Child Convention, or the economic and social and political rights. All of these covenants are not, and this is a commitment that Yemen have signed, so they're not mentioned. And in terms of the national frameworks as well, they don't mention the national dialogue outcomes. And when they do mention the national dialogue in the context analysis, they speak about it like in a, it seems like they're not aware of the outcomes. So, for example, they say the national dialogue has approved a quota of 30% for women in elected positions. But the truth is, it says in elected and appointed, so it's in all positions. So they don't mention it in the correct way. Now, the main components of the plan are 4 main components. So participation, prevention of conflict, and within that they specify also prevention of SGBV, sexual violence, and also terrorism. For some reason they mentioned terrorism, but there was no mention of the war the way we expected to, but they mentioned terrorism. And then protection as well, and then at the end it's humanitarian response rather than really early recovery and reconstruction, I would say. To group the participate, let's talk first about the first component, which is the participation. There is a lot of objectives to push for women's participation, but the good news is that they have a clear commitment to include women in the negotiation delegations by no less than 30%. And this type of participation, they identified the quota of no less than 30%. Everything else that they are pushing for participation, they don't mention the quota. So they say we will push for women's participation in decision-making positions, but they don't identify the percentage. The same they mention in observation committees. They say in observation committees on the ceasefire, on releasing the detainees, and on reconstruction and recovery, and in humanitarian committees. But this, they put the responsibility for security and defense ministry, for internal affairs and defense ministry, which means including women from security background only. It does not show that, for example, they're going to include civil society, women with civil society background or independent women in these committees. Another thing is that they talk about inclusion in, they talk about having DDR programs for women. Again, the inclusion is on security and military only. So when Aisling was talking, you divided into like institutional and strategic. I couldn't see this clearly in our plan. What I saw was objectives on participation, and then services for women survivors of conflict and like services, and then another was basically inclusion and services, and then basically like research and capacity building. This is how I grouped it. This is how it looked to me. And the capacity building items that we have in the plan, there is more than 10 capacity building required for women. They have done this, of course, for sure, without any real assessment of what really women are needing. And for the capacity building of women, they are proposing capacity building in negotiation and mediation, in disaster management and evacuation, in humanitarian response, and first aid and project management, and marketing, and even violence against women, the types of violence against women, refugees' rights, and transitional justice. So this already shows that they are not aware of what the women are capable of, because we know that women right now are playing a huge role in doing all of this. So suggesting to build their capacity in this, it shows the lack of understanding of the role of what women are already doing. They also propose some capacity building to civil servants and security, let's say, official, in the security sector, mainly on violence against women and legal and health, basically guidelines, and for women survivors of violence. This is, I think, good, but I believe that the security sector and the military sector requires even more heavily capacity building in terms of women's rights in general, including starting with Mola, who does not understand what is the national dialogue about. So to come to the services part, most of the services were focusing on either humanitarian or for survivors of violence services. The good thing is that they are asking for more shelters, so they put an objective for shelters for women. But the worrying thing is that they put the responsible for these shelters, the Public Works Ministry, which means they want to build it from zero. This is wrong. They can just find an existing building, rent it or buy it, but you don't have to go and build a new shelter. In Yemen, generally, there are only 4 shelters for women survivors of conflict, and this is actually a need. But we have also issues with those shelters. From our understanding, when we referred some women to go to these shelters, they were forced, for example, they were asked why you're not covering your face, give us your phone. So there are some kind of restrictions that are also not acceptable. It feels more like a prison rather than a shelter to protect women. So this also needs to be reviewed, and there is nothing to refer to this. They also suggest having a system for early warning system, but there is no description what they mean by that. They just say, we're going to have an early warning system. There is a lot on documentation of women's rights. They propose to have many teams to do documentation of women's rights, but they don't mention, they don't include, for example, in government institutions who are responsible for that, such as the National Commission who are investigating the alleged human rights violations because of the war. So they were not involved also in discussing this. They also talk about services in terms of health, psychosocial support, education, and legal aid, but then they say from protection from terrorism. Again, what does that mean? Like, we have very limited terrorist attacks that affect women. Why are they limiting it to these groups? Or am I understanding it wrong? I'm not sure, but to me, this is not clear. They talk about microloans, which is also another disaster in my mind, because I think what we need to give women at this stage is grants for them to go ahead and do, not let them be in another debt. And they talk about also DDR for women, so the demobilization, disarmament, and reintegration of women fighters, mainly women fighters with armed groups. So I think this is good, but also there was no clarity how they plan to do this. They talk about health sector, just mainly to provide mobile clinics to go to refugees and IDPs and affected women. It's not clear what they would mean by affected women. And we have a problem with the mobile clinics. For example, now in Aden, with all the corona, everything, there is so many cars, whether mobile clinics, whether ambulance cars that were given by the Saudis or the Emiratis, but no one is operating. So if we don't spend time to build the capacity of the civil servants in the health sector and support them with what they need, we're not going to have people operate all of this. They also talk about provision of humanitarian services to women, basically food, water, and in kind, and also livelihoods for IDP and IDPs and refugees. But these two items are like under the pledging humanitarian plan, so I'm not sure why they suddenly appear here in the women's security in the plan. So what are they missing? In terms of what they are missing, there was no talk, for example, for reparation for women who have been affected by the war. We know that there was some kind of assessment of, like, the government sent a committee to collect who is affected by the war, but they were only collecting the information of men. So there is, how are they going to do reparation for women? How are they going to provide? They talk about transitional justice in terms of building the capacity of women in transitional justice, but there is nothing in terms of services on transitional justice for women affected by the war. There was no mention to girls whatsoever in the plan, only women, women, women. There is nothing on girls, nothing on, for example, violence against girls, such as child marriage. There was no mention about child recruitment, and this is for us is a huge issue. Civil service representatives, we have shared repeatedly that we need to support the mothers who are mothers of abductees or mothers of child fighters. There's no mention to them whatsoever. Nothing is mentioned specifically about persons with disabled persons. So those who were injured or who had disability from before the war, there's no mention to their needs. There is nothing on human rights defenders. This for us is a huge issue, because most of the programs that exist right now for protection in Yemen is mainly led by Women Union, supported by UNFPA, but they only address like domestic violence issues. They're not, so the women political leaders who are being detained arbitrarily, women humanitarian workers, women peacemakers who have been detained, tortured, there is no services to them. And this is something we face in our organization, because we try to fundraise for this, and states, when we try to approach states that support gender and protection issues, they have told us that all their funding goes to UNFPA, and naturally UNFPA only funds Women Union, and Women Union only supports women who are domestic violence survivors, basically. So I think to conclude and to give recommendations, yes, this plan, the least that we can say about is disappointing, but it is something. And what we are hoping is that the states will now have an appetite to support the National Action Plan in Yemen, but by imposing and holding the government accountable to first include the civil society in revising the current draft. I don't think this draft has to come to life as it is, because it's just a huge mess. Nobody was consulted in it. Like if we start something wrong, like it's a plan that's supposed to be calling for inclusion, but there was no inclusion in it. So I think that's hypocritical. So first of all, I would say to sit with the government officials and encourage them to listen to the voices of the civil society organizations. Don't fund it unless they do meet the conditions to have revision and include the voices of the civil society voices. And also, generally, the government will need to still develop a budget for it. There is no budget was developed, and not a clear monitoring plan or even an implementation mechanism, because at some point I think there should be an implementation team formed from different joint implementation team representing government, civil society to work on that. And also thinking about how to regionalize it, to have regional plans to basically feed into the national one. And I will stop here. Sorry, I talked so much.
Thank you, Rasha. Yes, you have raised so many questions for me. I have a whole list here, but before I even take that prerogative, I want to turn back to Ashley. Would you like to come back on any of the points that Rasha has raised in, sort of having heard in detail her response to Yemen's, call it national action plan, that is in the process of being developed, and to add anything there?
Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Rasha. It's fascinating listening to you. And, your summary of the plan, I think, speaks to so much about the opportunities and challenges that we see with these action plans. I really take your point about at least we have something. And you hear so many civil society organisations around the world saying that about these kinds of instruments and how important they are in some sense, to give some framing or to be able to hold states to account to say, but you said you would do this, right? And there's an importance that we need to recognise with that, as much as we might, as you clearly are saying, critique some of the plans, and I do my own work as well, that both are important to have them, but also to make sure they're as best as they can be, right? And I think your presentation really speaks to that. One thing I wanted to, I suppose, engage with you on is you made a point about how the plan doesn't refer to the state's human rights commitments and human rights law. And I think that's really important, because what we're seeing with action plans globally is kind of a siloing effect, where you have an action plan on women, peace and security over here and all the other states' commitments on women's rights over there. And again, this separation of security from ordinary national planning or development or whatever it might be, depending on the context. And that's quite worrying, because security is not different from broader women's rights. It's an aspect of it, or it's a way that we conceive of women's rights through a particular lens, or it's just an aspect of the continuum of women's rights, whether it's violations or fulfillment of women's rights. And I think more and more important as we go forward, what we need to see, I think, is a joining up of a state's commitments. So their commitments around CEDAW with the WPS agenda. And we see a move towards that with the adoption of the Memorandum of Understanding between the CEDAW Committee and the SRSG's Office on Sexual Violence and Conflict, for example, and the potential that CEDAW, through its general recommendation 30 and 35, says around the need to lend, I suppose, the broader equality and rights focus to the WPS agenda, and that's very much needed in its implementation. And I think that's what I was trying to get at in my own presentation, is that, of course, we need to address these micro-level issues that women are experiencing, but part of that is really addressing the causes of discrimination in the first place, right? And trying to change some of that with us. And I think I'd love to hear more from you around the issue of transitional justice, if you wanted to speak about that. It's something I'm certainly interested in. I hope others are as well. You speak about the need for reparations, and often that issue gets forgotten, or it becomes conflated with the state delivering its basic services, rather than, as you said, and some of the really important things you've highlighted around child marriage, child recruitment, women being detained and tortured, the situation of human rights and defenders. What does reparations look like in a post-conflict Yemen? What would you like to see in the plan, or what would you like to see this plan do?
Thank you, Ashley. Just I wanted to give first some background. So in 2007, when Yemen had its CEDAW review, one of the recommendations after that was for Yemen to have a CEDAW action plan, actually. And when we went back to Yemen, I was representing the civil society at the time. We went back and we discussed with the National Women Committee to start drafting the action plan. And they did. They did a beautiful sectoral national action plan to implement the CEDAW. But then they went to UNFPA, and UNFPA was like, we don't have funding for this. So because the National Women Committee always relied on foreign funding. It was never, not enough government resources given to that main government agency. And because of this war and the division, basically the Women National Committee we have under the Houthi control, and then we have under the government control. I don't see like the donors were they kind of stopped supporting as well the national. So I would say go back to the National Women Committee and support this one. This has to be one of my recommendations within this. We need to support an institution that's supposed to do its job in terms of gender justice, and then find out also a way to have for them financial sustainability down the line. The second thing is that within the transitional period post the Arab uprising, when we had the transitional period between 2012 and 2014, we had a transitional strategy for stability. And within that plan, we had component of women, peace and security, including for women's protection and women's participation. So already there was some mainstreaming, I would say, for some elements within the national plan. And I would always push for components of women, peace and security to be integrated within the overall national country's plan. But currently we don't have. It's not clear for the government side what is their program. There is no published program. I only found the Houthis government program, but not the official legitimate government. And then we don't have a strategy for this current period. There was no national strategy what they're supposed to do. If donors decide to push to support the government in this, then let's mainstream as well components of the plan within those plans. So to talk about the transitional justice, this has been something really neglected in Yemen, whether during the national dialogue, there was a lot of talk, there was a draft of law for transitional justice that was being discussed. Most of the donors were focusing on the dialogue rather than dealing with the actual transitional justice issues. For example, we were supposed to have, it was formed, a reparation committee was formed, but this reparation committee had, for me, it existed on paper and on media. I don't know who are the members of this reparation committee. We know that they received funding from Qatar, for example, but there was no actual reparation process. And then the war happened. So we don't know what happened with that committee. There was a committee also mainly for the mass land claims problems that exist mainly in the south that existed. They started collecting information. I think they had more than 95,000 claims. So that's a complicated issue. And for women, that's even more complicated because women who now we have some forced disappearances who cannot claim whether their husbands are dead or how are they going to inherit those men, for example. Another thing is that is transitional justice going to be based on the existing discriminative laws for Yemen, with all of these guardianship rules that we have in the law, with the fact that women inherit half of that of the man, all of these. So I think transitional justice, when we design it, we need to put in terms of our commitments internationally. So based on equality and equity, not based on what we have existing, because the existing, we have only discriminative laws basically for women. So these issues are not included. And as I said, when the government started to collect the names of those affected by the wars, they only focused on the men. They did not collect information about the women. So injured women have no, the government does not support them with whatsoever. When we had women detained in Sana'a, and which we helped them to relocate to other areas within the government or outside of Yemen, the government does not have any support for these women. We give them only temporarily emergency funds for a few months, and then they are wherever they are with no means. They have already been uprooted from the areas where they lived, where they have their homes, to another area and without any support or means. All of this is not considered in the current plan.
Hey, Rasha, we've had a couple of questions come in. I don't know whether you can see on the chat. One is someone who's raised the questions. You speak of reparations today. It's very different from the period in 2012 to 14, clearly. Which issues would you include within the scope of a future redress mechanism? That's a huge question. I don't know. I'm not sure where you start on it.
Yeah, so the reparation in 2012 and 2014 included reparation for those who were forced to retirement, reparation for those who were injured because of the protests, reparation for those, the land claims issue that I said. So it had some elements. So now it's going to widen. It will include more violations and abuses, basically. So for Yemeni women, as I said, the detention and torture. This is the first time in Yemen's history that women are detained and tortured and even sentenced to death. Like we've never had cases like this before. Women are imprisoned, but for like crimes, but not like this, not like today, just because I'm working in the peace making field or humanitarian field or political leader, just being detained for freedom of speech or doing basically peace work. So there now we need to include SGBV issues, and we've actually managed to connect women who were formerly detained with Houthis and other armed groups with the Sanction Committee, the UN Security Council Sanction Committee, and the group of eminent experts. And their last reports that you've seen that was published in September by the group of eminent experts, or the one published just earlier this year by the Sanction Committee, clearly had strong SGBV documentation, and that's because of our role. And that translated into including SGBV crimes within the UN Security Council resolution adopted earlier this year to be in the crimes. So it's not only child recruitment, they added child recruitment and SGBV, which is good. This was big win for us. So that needs to be also under the transitional justice. We're currently also doing some track 2 consultation with women groups about this specific topic, and we hope we will have clear recommendations to share with the UN Envoy Office and the group of 19 states, sponsor of the peace process. You're muted, Louise.
I have a couple more questions that have been coming in. One is, do you worry that the existence of Yemen's NAP could be used as a substitute scapegoat for substantive policy changes? In other words, a distractor, really. Do you want to respond to that one, or would you like to hear the next one too? Well,
I can quickly respond to this one.
Yeah.
So I think it was done by the government to earn the goodwill or have some credits from the donors, have some legitimacy. That is why, because it was very rushed, especially for the adoption, was very rushed. The process was very rushed. And they knew that we were doing consultation when they rushed for this. They knew that we were doing consultation and we are going to submit. But so I think they only wanted that as a tick box. Yes, donors, now we have a national action plan, come and help us and recognize us, something like that.
Can you hear me? Have I muted myself? No, I haven't muted myself. We have a couple more that you can actually see coming up in chat. Someone from Somalia who's said where we have similar challenges when it comes to gaps in funding over reliance on partners as a result. What are the ways that you see to overcome this particular challenge, especially for countries coming out of conflict on a more longer term basis?
I think we share that worry with Somalia. We have been calling so much from the international community to have access for women to access funding in terms of flexible and core funding. For example, if we talk about the humanitarian pledge now, or the humanitarian plan, the pool of fund for the humanitarian plan, the OCHA has very difficult criteria for women-led organizations to access that funding. First, you have to be 2 years old organization. You have to have a license. You have to have a budget, an annual budget of $250,000. For Yemeni women-led organizations, this is so hard to meet. We've been trying to, and when we discussed this, the reply to us is like, no, this is good for you. You need to build your capacity to be able to meet this. So I think and also if you see their partners currently, the majority is men-led organizations that are the UN is relying on in delivering aid. But we have members of the Women's Solidarity Network doing humanitarian aid who are fundraising from women in the diaspora. They are doing great work. They're accessing remote areas. They're opening sieges from areas to send convoys. And they are not supported basically by official means, whether the UN channels or the government institutions. So I share that with Somalia, and I'm hoping that when the humanitarian pledging conference was happening today, we usually engage in the humanitarian pledging conference and we try to deliver a statement, but at this stage we are very disappointed. Our members reported throughout the years that there is humanitarian diversion. The aid is actually found at the front lines with armed groups. We've raised this many times about the corruption and diversion, and no one is listening. And so this time we decided we're stepping back on all of this mess. So until we have, and the problem is now we have COVID, and there's huge challenges for COVID, and COVID is used now to fundraise. But if we fundraise to the same system that is corrupt and not helping the people, the right holders, then we are contributing basically to this war. We're not really alleviating the suffering of the people.
I want to pick up on that point because you've introduced COVID-19, and it's something that Aisling and I had talked about a couple of days ago, and it relates to the next question that I have coming up on chat, which is really to both panelists. Do you think there is a possibility of deprioritizing the WPS agenda in general and that implementation in the context of COVID-19? And what could be the best strategies to ensure that governments integrate crisis and emergency aspects such as the current pandemic and repercussions into NAP implementation plans?
Sure. Yeah. Will I go, or Rasha, do you want to?
No, you go ahead. I think I'll talk after.
Okay, great. Thanks. And actually, just before I do, Louise, if I may just note on the question about funding, because I think it's really important. And just to share lessons learned, I worked myself in humanitarian contexts for years, and what I saw in many conflicts that were, countries coming out of conflict where states, international donors stepped in and funded the gender equality elements. As Rasha said, it's so important to have that happen. But I think we have to be very mindful of the consequences of that, because what I've seen in multiple post-conflict states is that because donors, I suppose, specialise and treat gender equality as a special issue when they start funding it, the state, in some senses, takes that as an excuse to step back from funding gender equality. And so when the international funding dries up and they're not interested anymore, there's no funding for the women-focused institutions. And I think the big lesson learned there is that where we have international donors funding gender equality imperatives in conflict and post-conflict contexts, we need an exit strategy. And that exit strategy is an agreement with government to take over funding gender equality through national revenues and through the national budget. And that has to be in place, or those institutions will fall apart the minute that the international donors go. So that's, I think, a key lesson learned. And then I'm going to move on, as you said, to the COVID-19. I read that question, and there's another question that Mary said, is that okay? I'll put those together from Anouk, who also asks about, whether the COVID-19 pandemic offers us an opportunity to add those more essential practical needs to planning. And I think those two are really important. I've been looking at national action plans through the lens of the current pandemic, and there's loads of things to say about this. And I think one of the things that we're seeing already is that we're seeing, particularly in this region, I've been looking at this region, is states are saying, like we hear all the time about women's rights, we don't have time for that right now. we have a pandemic, we have a crisis, so national action plans, women's rights, we don't have time for that right now, rather than understanding that actually implementing your national action plan is a key part of your response to the COVID-19 crisis, particularly in a region such as this where there is mass humanitarian crisis, mass displacement of people who are highly dependent and wholly dependent on humanitarian outputs and that system of humanitarianism, and their lives are structured around the political crises that are dominoing affecting around the region. So rather than seeing national action plans as mutually exclusive from the global pandemic, what we want to see is national responses to the pandemic integrate and include what national action plans are doing and use the action plans as a mechanism to do so. Now, there's loads of ways to do that. And I think we think about the pillars of a response to a pandemic, which are social protection mechanisms around gender-based violence. National action plans have that. An economic response, which is the key part, I think, that's missing in post-conflict context with national action plans, which is a focus on women's livelihoods and the key point that Rasha made around grants for women to start their own businesses. And of course, the health response. And it's not just health services, it's health rights, reproductive rights for women and girls. And all of that is part of women, peace and security. And of course, it's all part of a COVID-19 response. And I think that's really, really important. And I think Anoop's question is important in whether this pivots us back to the practical needs. I think that is an opportunity to do so. But I suppose I would like to express a bit of caution around that. I think there's precarity around us pivoting WPS planning towards practical needs only, because we don't want to lose the strategic element. We have to make sure women and girls and men and boys and transgender identity people have their absolute everyday needs fulfilled, but that has to be a way then to ensure that their broader strategic rights are also filled. So it's a balance between both. For example, the Indonesian National Action Plan is very much focused around practical needs. So their whole plan is humanitarian services and humanitarian delivery of goods, which is really needed. But civil society in Indonesia would argue that that's not good enough because it's not doing enough to advance the participation and decision-making rights of women and girls in that context as well. And you could argue, are states going to have plans that are only micro-level focused to say, oh, we're doing WPS, but then not actually change their structures and systems to ensure that women and girls have a right and have a say and have an influence on how our structures are formed in the first place. So as much as, yes, there's an opportunity here, again, it's about really, I think, the key thing is what is the reality of our context? What's going on for women and girls? What do they prioritise? What do they need? And how do we get our systems to respond in a way that's inclusive and is restructured towards that more transformative and of transforming the social norms that create these problems in the first place? Rasha.
Thank you, Aisling. I couldn't agree more. So for the COVID, I think, yes, it is now deprioritizing gender issues, gender justice issues in Yemen. Even for us as Peace Track Initiative, especially that we are seeking all the time for the emergency protection grants for women rights defenders. When we approach our current partners who support us with these grants, they have reduced the funding for security issues of security protection issues and are redirecting now to COVID response, which is not necessarily the needs for a number of like it is a problem, but it should not. We should not. There should be like new allocation for COVID. Don't redirect what you have existing. Increase that because we need the security aspects, but increase add allocations and commitments for the COVID response. And this is also what we are seeing. Like very recently, I know that UN Women were working on a project to revive women's participation, specifically to support the Yemeni Women Pact for Peace and Security. But this project has been shelved, and I think the focus now, and I think pushed by the donors, is to focus on COVID. So, and this is also a problem because in the peace process, if we look at the peace process, COVID was used to initiate ceasefire, and we're not seeing a ceasefire. We're seeing that there is there is escalation in fighting. Actually, new fronts are opening, And the attention is now all on COVID as a savior as well. I'm like, and the people are still fighting. The fighters, if they're not afraid of bullets, they're not going to be afraid of COVID virus. They're ready to die. So our work in ceasefire as well is affected because of the prioritizing of COVID response. I'm not saying there is no need. Yemen is the worst humanitarian crisis. The COVID is adding another devastating layer to what is happening. People are dying in Aden, my hometown. We hear on daily basis about people dying between 80 to 100 people on daily basis. And there is no system, no health system to respond. And I am blaming the failure of the humanitarian plan that existed since years ago. Even before the war, we were already talking about a humanitarian crisis in Yemen. And we had pledges such as today's pledges, but there was no investment on the real sustaining issues. There should have been investment on the water, on electricity, on livelihoods of people, but the plan dedicates only 3% on livelihoods, no investment on electricity sector or water. It's all based on distribution of food aid that ends up with armed groups. They had, in 2016, suspended programs that are addressing disarmament and demobilization of children, fighters. It doesn't respond to the needs. And there is no consultation actually with the women and the groups about the humanitarian needs. And this is actually, the UN actually raised that because the Houthis also prevented them to do any assessments. So this was one of the problems. And then they are complaining why nobody wants to fund the pledging, the humanitarian pledge, because it's dysfunctional. It's not working. Why are we going to fund? I'm not happy with it, how it is existing. It's not helping the people.
Thank you, Rasha. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points there. You know, with COVID, what we see and what we clearly see in any situation where there is, for example, a public health crisis, is a shift in resources. And the shift in resources generally means that women, and particularly maternal health, reproductive health, those areas are disproportionately negatively affected. Now, I know we all know that the war, the very many years of war, has absolutely decimated the Yemeni health system. With COVID now rampant in many of its cities, you know, I'm hearing really terrible stories about women and the lack of access to maternal health care, reproductive rights. And it kind of ties in with the question that's come up on Facebook. Can you tell us a little bit about how the global gag rule and the lack of reference to sexual and reproductive health in Security Council resolutions has affected the WP's agenda progress in Yemen? So it's kind of like, you know, the practicalities, but the resource shift, but also the bigger political context of how women's bodies become the site of the worst oppressions.
Unfortunately, Louise, Yemen ranked last in the gender gap index even before the war. It was always said as the worst country for women to exist. You can imagine now with all of this multidimensional insecurities, what they are facing. It's just beyond imagination. But women, and I'm always saying that Yemeni women are resilient and strong. We should not think about them as passive victims. They are really what they are keeping the community together with their very limited resources and resilience on their own. So they would walk for miles to secure food for their families, or choose to walk through checkpoints by armed groups, enduring harassment, because they want to protect their men from being kidnapped. Yes, in terms of sexual and reproductive rights, this has been, like health system in general has collapsed. There hasn't been a lot of focus on this. Actually, the gender-based violence response programs are not funded enough by the humanitarian pledging conference. At some point, they had a sub-cluster on gender-based violence. They combined it under protection, and it kind of melted, I would say. We're not clear how much is being spent on that, on gender-based violence response right now. It's not clear. Another thing is actually documentation of women's rights. So the main organization that's doing documentation based on the cases reported of violence is Women Union, which is funded by UNFPA. And since 2015, there hasn't been any published reports about the status of violence. And when we ask to have these reports, they're saying it's confidential. I don't think they even share it with another UN agencies or committees who are documenting the women's rights and abuses. And this is a problem if you're not sharing information. And I think they're not sharing because they are afraid if they do share, especially those perpetrated by armed groups, if they do share, then they're going to be at risk from being basically kicked out of the country, and then they will not have access, or their staff will be subject to harassment or abuse. So I think there is a huge problem right now with in terms of violence against women, and the amount of commitment to address it is not enough.
Thank you. Ashley, can I bring you in this conversation, because I can see another question coming in here from Iona to everyone, asking you, after 20 years of 1325, where do you think the WPS agenda is heading, given current politics and trends in new NAPs being developed, and where should we be going to make sure the WPS lives up to its transformative potential? Oh my goodness, a dissertation, a PhD. Would you like to share your views, insights there?
Sure, thanks Louise, and thanks Iona. Put me on the spot, why don't you?
I'm so sorry.
No, not you. I'm joking with Iona. No, it's a perfect question, and it's so important. And the reason I said that is that, you know, where do we go from here? And particularly the reason I suppose I'm saying this is such a challenge is because of current politics. What we've seen in the last 5 to 10 years in the United Nations, so if we think the macro level where the resolutions have emerged from, we've seen some of the greatest pushback on gender equality within those spaces than ever since the founding of the United Nations. And there's a very specific, targeted, orchestrated, I would say, pushback against gender equality norms in the UN system. And so when we think of the WPS agenda forward, I struggle then to say, well, where can we go from here? Because part of me is worried about us holding on to what we have already without that being regressed upon. And I refer to countries like the United States, who right now in multilateral negotiation spaces are contesting the word gender, they're contesting the idea of women's rights in any way, shape or form, taking part of any kind of normative agreements that are coming out of the United Nations. So the next 20 years needs to be about holding the line. And holding the line on gender equality, unfortunately. If I was to wave my magic wand and wish for a future, I think that looks better. And if we set aside the realism, I suppose, the politics of the Security Council and these factors that are inhibiting a lot of what Rasha is talking about is needed on the ground, I think a way forward is that link with human rights norms. I think we've got to get the UN to get serious about linking up its pillars on human rights, development and security. They're not separate. They are parts of the whole of what the function of the United Nations is supposed to be. And we've got to get that development focused, rights focused agenda speaking to and within the Security Council and within the WPS agenda, and namely CEDAW, right? And that link with CEDAW that provides for us around structural discrimination and structural inequalities. And part of that is marrying what we're talking about. So there's two things. One is, I think we need a bit of a shift from talking about women to talking about gender equality. And we put the two together a lot of the time, but I don't think we're doing enough to really talk about gender power relations, because that's what we need to tackle. So that women, peace and security needs to be about gender, peace and security, and taking this agenda forward to make changes for women and girls in respect of gender inequalities, and to marry that up and link with other structural discriminations, whether that's race, ethnicity, disability, sexualities, etc., and to have a more holistic approach to when we talk about inequalities, because women are not monolithic or one-dimensional people. We are all a number of different identities in different spaces. And I think for WPS in over 20 years to make a difference in women's lives, I'd love to see a deeper approach to gender being the language that we use, and to gender equality and different kinds of inequalities being I suppose where we're steering towards in addressing and making change in people's lives.
Thank you, Aisling, for that. Rasha, we're getting to the end. In fact, we've just gone over a minute over the allocated time. But I wonder, can I invite you to come back in and sort of say a few words, put some concluding remarks about Yemen at this stage?
Sure. I just saw a question, Louise, that I want to respond to very quickly. Okay. Was about the National Agenda on Women, Peace and Security and the National Action Plan and how women are involved. So the National Agenda for Women, Peace and Security was a civil society-led process with involvement of women in government officials, not that they were not involved. And I was taking the lead on this. It was in 2016, and we consulted with 76 women leaders inside and outside the country and from different sectors. Government, civil society, journalists, lawyers, judges, all women backgrounds, whether South, North, everybody was involved. And I said this agenda was shared with the UN Security Council and was welcomed in 2017. And to us, that was like the guidelines or the strategic framework for us to coordinate our efforts to push for implementation of the Women, Peace and Security. And one of the recommendations was to support Yemen to have its own national action plan. Now we are doing an update for that national agenda. So what we were doing consultations in parallel. These consultations with on the National Action Plan draft, and at the same time to update our own strategy, because we were already predicting that the National Action Plan might not end up the way we wanted. So for us, the National Agenda is more like a framework. It has to be comprehensive. It's not timed. It's not for a few years. So it can be more comprehensive. We're doing this update, and what we have done is consultation with women in the security sector, women civil society leaders, women who are affected by the war in terms of women who are injured, women who are by mines, by different types of explosives, women who are mothers of child fighters, women who are displaced, and from different areas. Including in Sana'a, including in Marib and Adan. These are the main governorates with this. Some of these consultations were based on entirely volunteering efforts, no funding, and some we were able to secure funding from WELF and Norway to do this process. So hopefully by October we will have an updated national agenda. And in terms of the involvement, as I said, these were all grassroots women who are consulted, led by women-led organizations who did the consultation. For the National Action Plan, there wasn't much involvement, as I said, in developing it. We tried to share our recommendations and they were not integrated. There is a lot of recommendations or objectives that resonate with our recommendations for sure. For example, the participation of women in the negotiations, supporting women, different services we have asked for it, but that was not enough. It's not written, and like there is always gaps in each one objective they have put. There is gaps. It's not clear who is what is the mechanism, how they are planning to implement. It's not clear. So there is a huge room for improvement. Just to end with a note, I think the easiest thing to implement from the Women, Peace, Security agenda is to include women in the peace process. And within the current National Action Plan, they talk about the 30% in the negotiation delegations, and then within the responsibility column, they put the cabinet of ministers and the UN. So there is a blame there for UN for not including. This is just because we have come to the conclusion that the UN failure in designing an inclusive process is the reason why women are not included. We can see already commitments from the government that they want to include. and we're not yet seeing this materialize within the UN-led process. So I'll end up here. Good. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Rasha. I think you have challenged the UN system, and any of those who are attending today's event who are from governments to reflect on what part they might be able to play in putting pressure on the UN system itself to ensure that Yemeni women are indeed included in the peace process, the peace negotiations. That is the minimum that surely we should be expecting from the UN. Anyway, before I bring the entire meeting to a close, I just wanted to flag an event that Zoe Gillard, our centre manager, has flagged on the 29th and 30th. There is an event that we're hosting. So I think if you go online to our website, you'll find more details there. But I'm not quite sure how one goes about thanking speakers if through a virtual audience. But perhaps you can all join me in thanking our speakers today, because I have learned so much and really benefited from their insights you have shared with us. So thank you, Rasha, for joining us, and thank you, Aisling, too. So, thanks very much.